Okay, let's start with an overview of the 5 types of power from the right use of power framework. Now, these types of power are really meant to give us some insight into where power comes from and how it shows up in our day to day interactions with other people. And so, power really does start at this level of personal power. Each of us comes to the table, each of us comes to the world and our relationships with a certain amount of personal power, the ability to affect change that's really rooted in ourselves as individuals and the energy that we woke up with that morning and that we're able to harness and use in that moment, right? Personal power is fundamentally different than role power or positional power, right? The power that's granted to roles when we step into those roles in society. And so oftentimes there's a job description attached to those roles or expectations to the job title, a salary, and there's certain expectations, and we negotiate with other people for the power that's embedded into our roles. But personal power and role power, two of the most probably obvious types of power that we encounter on a daily basis, both formal roles and informal roles. And then we move into a conversation about status, right? The power associated with the membership that we have in different groups in society. And those are often identity based things. They could be language or ethnicity. They could be gender and sexual orientation. Lots of things. We could probably get a big list going of the different statuses and the power that they give to us in different contexts in society. Once we move past the level of the individual and their role, personal, and status power, we get to collective power, the power of institutions and organizations, both formal and informal, where we harness the power of the collective to affect change on a bigger scale. And of course, all of this is nested within systemic power, which is really what we're here to talk about today with Christian Ortiz, which is the structures and the stories and the symbols and the language that we use to inform the rest of the experiences that we have together, that set a lot of the ground rules or the edges of the sandbox when it comes to the experiences that we have inside of a given system. And so systemic power exists at a big societal level. It also exists inside of systems themselves, whether that's healthcare or education or governance. And we're going to dig into systemic power a little bit more today as a briefing for the conversation with Christian. Okay, so when we think about systemic power, we think about structured power and often a dualistic type of power. And so we'll get into that in a second. But really, what we're looking at are the stories and the symbols and the languages, legends, and mindsets that give shape to a system. Some examples here, we might get those stories and those languages around economics, right? Capitalism fundamentally is a story. It's a type of systemic power that says, if we behave in this way, if we create free markets, that will give us this type of experience together. We have religious systems and we have political systems, and all of them are interacting with each other. And we don't have to look very far into the headlines to see the collision of economic, religious, and political systems of power playing itself out in front of us in real time. We have to talk about things like the patriarchy and paternalism, right? Especially in Western society, around white supremacy and settler colonialism. We have to talk about the different paradigms and worldviews that are competing or intersecting with each other. Fundamentally, it often comes down to getting to this dualistic notion of extractive systems versus regenerative systems. And so I'm sure we're going to dig into some of this with Christian, but the goal here is to give us a bit of a shared language around when we're talking about systemic power, what is it that we're actually talking about? And how is it different perhaps than personal power or role power or status power, right? Systemic power really exists at the level of the ecosystem, right? That informs a lot of the downstream, demonstrations of power or how power gets used in society. For example, something that's not on the list here, but that I see every time I look into our society is this myth or this legend of individualism, right? And we see how individuals get elevated to a status, right, of celebrity or guru or whatever it happens to be. And the mindset becomes one of individualism over collectivism. And I think we can, again, not have to look too far into society, into the current headlines to see individualism playing itself out in our society. Right. So I'm looking forward to digging into this and much more with Christian Ortiz at our session on Thursday. Hopefully this was a helpful primer to get us ready to go for that conversation.